I should not have survived the first hour on Frosthold 9. Thermometers registered negative 420 degrees Celsius within the so-called habitable tunnels, and yet I walked among my men, breath crystallizing before it could leave my lungs. I am Commissar Taranis of the 23rd Arctic Regiment, and I swear upon the Emperor's light, what we encountered here defies both logic and liturgy. We arrived at the Adeptus Mechanicus outpost at 0500 hours, the sky above a slate void punctuated by the auroras of a dying sun. The throne, a structure whispered about in classified Mechanicus reports, rose from the glacial expanse, jagged and impossible, as if the ice itself had grown into architecture. My regiment was tasked with securing it. Orders were clear: reconnaissance, retrieval of any data cores, and elimination of any anomalous threat. From the first steps into the ice tunnels, reality began to fracture. Snowdrifts moved uphill, defying every law of physics I had learned at Schola Progenium. Our sensors flickered erratically, recording temperatures that oscillated wildly, spikes of heat that burned as frost simultaneously claimed our extremities. The first patrol vanished without trace. Sergeant Halveck's Vox reported static, then a single word repeated in tones that were neither human nor machine. Return. We pressed on. My men's breath hung as glittering shards, each exhalation a prayer against the cold, a litany of endurance. The tunnel's walls seemed to shift subtly in peripheral vision. Geometric anomalies formed where none should exist. It was not merely that the ice was alive, it was the architecture of thought made tangible. Footfalls echoed against impossible angles, sounds bending around corners that could not exist. The air carried the metallic tang of frozen blood, and I swear I saw the imprint of hands pressed into the ice, fingers splayed in supplication or warning. These were not soldiers, yet their footprints matched ours, duplicating, overlapping, vanishing. Sensors and instruments recorded the absence of matter where bodies had been moments before. Comms buzzed intermittently. My own voice returned distorted, layered over some other signal, a litany of worship, a prayer in a tongue long extinct, mechanical tones fused with ecclesiastic chant. I could not tell if it was coming from the throne or from inside my own mind. We advanced through corridors that had no beginning or end, stairs spiraling into ceilings, airlocks opening onto voids of pure, black cold. The first real test came when a scout reported a silhouette, human-shaped, featureless, moving uphill toward the throne. Our instruments could not see it. Thermals, motion sensors, even the human eye failed. Yet there it was, a spectre against the snow, shifting, inverted shadows trailing where light should have fallen. I ordered containment protocols, the regiment forming a perimeter, weapons raised. Yet fear spread faster than discipline. Some men stared into corners and muttered prayers. Others refused to move, frozen by some unseen cognition. I counted the squad, one short. Another soldier, Corporal Dreven, whispered in terror that the walls were breathing. The throne itself pulsed faintly, a resonance that penetrated bone. It was a heartbeat, but not alive in any way I could recognize. It drew our attention and our fear, as if it sensed the inevitability of our arrival. My own reflection appeared in the ice, though the angle was impossible, staring back at me, with eyes not my own. We set up camp in a cavern beneath the throne, temperature sensors unstable, frost forming strange symbols on the walls, numerals, sigils, patterns that repeated with mechanical precision. My log records these, though I cannot yet decipher meaning. Even now, I hear the whispering of something beyond comprehension, speaking in cadence with the hiss of the frozen wind. Our first night passed, or what passed for night. Hours, or perhaps minutes, melded into one another. Patrols returned with tales of corridors looping back impossibly, of voices of comrades speaking from walls. One squad vanished entirely, leaving behind only a shard of ice shaped like a skull. Instruments marked the event as null, yet the air remained heavy with their absence. I write this as we prepare to move deeper. Each step into Frosthold 9 confirms what I have feared. This is no ordinary anomaly. The throne is alive, or something inhabiting it is. Time, space, even matter are subordinate to its presence. Every man under my command is at risk, not merely of death, but of erasure, of becoming a footnote in some cruel experiment of the warp. And yet we move forward. Orders must be obeyed. Discipline must prevail. I record this for the Emperor, for the Mechanicus, for any who might follow. Should this account survive, it is the testament of what Frosthold 9 truly holds. A frozen throne, impossible and watching, where fear is currency and life is expendable. As I close this entry, a scout hails from the ridge. He sees something moving against the wind, shadows inverted, impossible. My men peer. Some see a future version of themselves staring back. Sensors report 0 life forms. Comms crackle with static, then the single word again. Return. I do not know if we can. I am Magos Prima Octavus, and I arrived at Frosthold 9 not by chance, but by protocol. A response to the anomaly reported by Commissar Taranis and the 23rd Arctic Regiment. The throne stands at the center of the frozen plateau, jagged ice forming unnatural spires that pierce the grey void above. From my first step onto the frost-crusted ground, the air itself seemed to pulse with resonance. A vibration, not mechanical nor purely psychic, but a fusion of both. Our sensors registered intermittent signals, not of human origin, yet encoded in a pattern that suggested intelligence. The readings fluctuated violently, data streams warping, repeating, fracturing as if the throne was speaking through the ice. I recorded the first observation, numbers cycling in sequences impossible for standard computation, prime ratios embedded within complex liturgical cadences. A micro cliffhanger of cognition. The throne was already aware of our presence. I directed the regiment to a peripheral ice cavern. Here, the first environmental hazards became apparent. Frost crystallized in mid-air, forming sigils that glimmered faintly when our lanterns passed over them. Soldiers reported whispers, tonal oscillations blending sacred litanies with Mechanicus jargon. I analyzed the signals. Telemetry indicated neither atmospheric distortion nor psychogenic feedback. These were intentional transmissions, transmitted by some unknown conduit within the throne. The anomaly began to affect biology. Frostbite spread unnaturally fast, first to extremities, then along sinews in a creeping crystalline lattice. One soldier's arms stiffened, veins glowing faintly, pulsating in rhythm with the throne's resonance. Attempts to intervene failed. Traditional medical protocol could not contend with this. I documented meticulously. Our instruments registered an energy fluctuation pattern aligning precisely with the frost inscriptions etched on cavern walls. Time itself seemed fractured. Patrols reported loops in movement, corridors folding back upon themselves. Comms reported echoes of conversations from previous hours, voices repeating questions before they had been asked. A recurring numeric motif, 13, appeared embedded in frost patterns, glyphs forming sequences in walls, floors, and instruments. The significance eluded me, yet my subconscious mind recognized it as a ritual coordinate, a signature left by some long-lost ecclesiarch or Mechanicus sect. I dispatched a small recon team toward the throne. Sensors failed at the threshold. What remained of their telemetry was a distorted overlay, their positions duplicated, some appearing multiple times in impossible locations. Through the crackle of static, I discerned whispered voices repeating our own names. The men returned, or perhaps returned, but not entirely as themselves. Eyes vacant, movements synchronized with the frost sigils. One whispered, "The throne remembers." As I analyzed telemetry, instruments recorded what I can only describe as future echoes. Data spikes corresponded to events that had not yet occurred. Men disappearing, corridors shifting, frost inscriptions forming patterns moments before our eyes. The throne was altering the causal chain, bending our perception and the environment simultaneously. A micro cliffhanger. In one sensor sweep, I recorded a figure appearing atop the throne. No human should have climbed the spire, yet there it stood, featureless, frozen, shadow inverted against the lightless sky. Environmental horror intensified. Frost fog thickened, dense as blood mist, each breath a struggle. Metallic tang pervaded the air, yet no wounds were visible. Sound behaved contrary to physics. Echoes arrived before speech, footsteps registered where none had passed. I noted the first instance of body resonance. A soldier's breath crystallized into a word. Obedience. Frozen mid-air, vibrating in sync with the throne's pulse. We attempted ritual interpretation. The throne's signals, numeric, tonal, geometric, suggested a hybridized liturgy, a mechanicus prayer interwoven with warp signatures. The frost formations reflected these patterns. I hypothesized that the throne was more than a conduit. It was a vessel designed to manipulate matter, biology, and perception simultaneously. The more we observed, the more our instruments failed. Every attempt at containment or analysis was recorded and yet altered, a feedback loop feeding directly into the throne's resonance. Small-scale horrors unfolded. Frost inscriptions on walls rearranged themselves while observed. Patrols reported shadows detaching from bodies, climbing walls, tracing sigils with their fingertips without leaving physical trace. A corporal vanished entirely. Instruments confirmed zero thermal or motion signatures, yet his voice remained on comms, distorted, whispering coordinates of an impossible path. We realized the throne was not dormant. It was feeding, calculating, converting our fear, our loyalty, and our presence into energy. Each observation, each step, contributed to its amplification. The first partial understanding dawned. The throne's signals were a ritual of extraction, transforming the corporeal into resonance, matter into song. The macro cliffhanger emerges as a soldier reports seeing his own reflection atop the throne, grinning, a visage we had yet to witness in reality, and which vanished before verification. As night, or what passed for night, descended, I recorded the following. The throne is alive, and it perceives through multiple dimensions simultaneously. Its signals are not merely telemetry, they are a lure, a framework of ritualized horror, an interface between the frost and the warp. Our presence is being catalogued, converted, and directed into sequences we cannot yet comprehend. I prepare now to move closer, despite the warnings of logic, instinct, and protocol. Each step risks becoming another entry in the throne's ledger of existence. Yet if the Mechanicus is to reclaim understanding, if the Emperor's light is to endure in this place of frozen nightmares, we must continue. And so we advance, sensors flickering, breath crystallizing, footsteps measured, eyes haunted. The throne whispers, pulses, and awaits. I, Commissar Tyrannus, resume this account with a hand that trembles, though no cold of mortal world should shake me so. What we found upon the second day within Frosthold 9 was not merely strange, it was sacrilege given form, a heresy against the very principles of matter, order, and liturgy. We advanced deeper into the ice corridors beneath the Forsaken Throne. The air grew, thick, almost liquid, resisting each breath. Sound carried strangely. The roar of the storm outside muted to a thin hiss, while other noises, the drip of meltwater, the scrape of boots, resounded as if magnified through cathedral vaults. Then came the chants, faint, almost beneath perception, woven into the wind. A liturgical cadence, neither ecclesiarchy nor mechanicus in origin, yet bearing the rhythm of both. The syllables gnawed at the mind, recognizable and yet utterly alien. The men stiffened at first hearing. Some whispered prayers of their own, others clutched their lasguns tighter, eyes darting toward the walls as though expecting the ice itself to sing aloud. The chants persisted, weaving in and out of comms traffic, faint echoes embedded between vox bursts, I ordered silence, but silence was impossible. The very air seemed to hum with the throne's song. Geometric anomalies grew more blatant. A passage we marched through bent back upon itself, returning us to our starting point after only 5 minutes' walk. Frost on the walls arranged itself into angular spirals, shifting subtly when unobserved. We tried marking the walls, only to watch our insignias vanish into the frost as if absorbed. Even the lumen strips failed to shine properly. Light refracted strangely, producing double shadows where one body stood. At 0730 hours, I counted the squad again. We had begun with 32. Now, I found 31. Private Kirill had vanished. No scream, no struggle, only his boots left behind, laces still tied, steam rising faintly from the warmth that should have been his body. His vox beads still transmitted faintly. From it came not his voice, but the continuation of the chant. Words garbled and stretched, as if spoken from beneath an ocean of ice. Panic simmered, threatening to boil. I barked litanies of discipline, invoking the Emperor's light and the chain of command. Yet even as I spoke, I heard my words return from the corridor ahead, seconds before I uttered them. Time's order faltered here. My men froze at the sound of my own voice echoing prophecy, commanding them before I had drawn breath. The number 13 began to manifest everywhere. Our auspex displayed it in diagnostic subroutines, repeating endlessly in place of standard error codes. Frost formations bore 13 radiating lines, 13 spirals, 13 fractures in ice sheets. Even the count of heartbeats per breath seemed to fall into the pattern. None of us voiced it aloud. Instinct warned us to avoid giving it form through language. Yet we all saw it. A minor ritual of horror unfolded as we advanced. Footprints appeared on the walls and ceilings alongside our own. Some bore the tread of our boots, others did not. They walked where no man had walked, mirroring our steps, but inverted. One trooper swore he saw a figure pacing above us, head bent down like a spider, moving in perfect rhythm with our formation. His lasfire burst, shattered only ice and silence. The deeper we pressed, the more reality itself thinned. Shadows lengthened, stretching down corridors that led nowhere. Vox reports of squads ahead conflicted. Two groups claimed to occupy the same location, though each swore the other was a hallucination. I began to suspect both were correct. Then came the first liturgical break. Corporal Dreven fell to his knees mid-march, eyes glassy, lips moving in rhythm with the chant. His breath crystallized into visible script before him, words etched in frozen air. I pulled my bolt pistol, standard protocol for corruption, but the magos intervened, eager to study the phenomenon. As Draven exhaled, the words formed sequences of prayers, half Imperial Creed, half Binharic computation. Each line concluded with the same phrase, "The throne is witness." We restrained Drevan, but the damage was done. The men began to whisper amongst themselves that the throne had chosen him, that it was no longer safe to speak aloud for fear their words would be claimed and altered. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the whispers of frost and the endless, unseen chant. At 1100 hours, we attempted to establish a tactical grid. Auspex arrays mapped our positions relative to the throne. What appeared was impossible. Some soldiers existed in two places at once, duplicated, ghost echoes marching parallel to their real bodies. One entry displayed my own identifier twice, one standing beside me, the other stationed within the throne itself. I stared into the frost walls then, and for an instant I saw myself reflected, yet not reflected. My double stared back with a gaze colder than death, lips mouthing words I could not hear. When I blinked, it was gone. The magos insisted we press further to gather data at the throne's base. I agreed. Duty and discipline demanded it. But already I sensed the truth. Each step deeper drew us further from the Emperor's light, further from the order of real space. We moved forward, silent, but for the crunch of boots on frost, each sound chased by echoes that did not belong to us. The litany grew louder, resonant in skull and marrow. The number 13 returned again and again, carved into ice like the signature of some ancient priesthood. The men do not speak now. They only look to me, their eyes wide, each silently begging that I carry the burden of command in this place where the laws of nature and faith alike unravel. I will carry it. For them, for the Imperium, for the Emperor. But as I close this entry, I confess one truth that I must record for any who may find these words. The chant no longer comes from the walls. It comes from within, from the hollow places of the mind where prayers once resided, and it grows louder. By the time Father Miguel left the Withers family plot, the sun had already begun to sink low over the jagged horizon of New Mexico. The dying light painted the mesa in crimson and gold, but for those who lived near the Withers cemetery, the colours of dusk carried no beauty, only dread. For dusk was when the voices began. A group of cowhands, hardened men used to the loneliness of the desert, were the first to whisper about it. On nights when they tethered their horses too close to the plot, they heard sounds rising faintly through the hard-packed soil, soft scratches, like fingernails raking against wood. At first, they blamed prairie animals burrowing in search of food. But animals did not weep. Animals did not call out the names of their mothers in cracked, broken tones. The tales spread quickly among the settlement. Children were warned not to linger near the plot after sunset. Mothers whispered prayers when the wind carried a faint sobbing across the dry earth. The older men scoffed, claiming it was superstition, yet none dared spend a night by the cemetery to prove themselves right. And then came the first exhumation. Sheriff Albright, pressured by the settlement's growing unrest, ordered the bodies of the Withers children dug up. He assured everyone it was a matter of respect, that rumours of scratching, voices and ghostly shapes would be put to rest once the graves were inspected. Yet when the coffins were pried open, the gathered crowd recoiled in horror. Inside, the children's faces were twisted in expressions of terror. Deep grooves marked the inner wood of the coffin lids. Tiny, bloodied fingers were broken at odd angles, their nails splintered from frantic clawing. The sight was enough to silence even the most skeptical among them. They were alive when buried, one of the men muttered under his breath, crossing himself. God forgive us, they were alive. The bodies were reburied with trembling hands, but peace did not follow. The scratching began again, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. Worse still, some swore the children's eyes opened briefly as they were lowered back into the soil, glimmering with wetness, unblinking, as though pleading not to be forgotten. The Withers plot became a place no one dared approach after dark. Dogs barked at empty air near the graves. Horses shied and refused to pass the fence line, and each time the townsfolk worked up the courage to dig the children back out, the same thing was found: torn coffins, broken nails, mouths frozen in soundless screams. 13 times they were exhumed. 13 times they were reburied. But the horror was only beginning. For on the 13th reburial, the earth itself seemed unwilling to accept them. The ground heaved and split, coughing up clumps of dry soil, as if rejecting the bodies it had been forced to consume. One of the gravediggers, pale with fear, dropped his shovel and swore he saw a small hand twitch as the coffin settled. Father Miguel returned, his voice trembling with scripture. Yet even as he blessed the graves with holy water, the faint sound of fingernails scraping beneath the surface carried on the wind. No prayer silenced it, and in the silence of the desert nights, the children's cries grew, louder, less like echoes, and more like voices trying desperately to answer those who dared listen. The desert had always been a place of silence, a silence broken only by the cry of a hawk or the hiss of wind across stone. But at the Withers burial ground, silence had become something else, something dreadful. It pressed in on the chest, made the air too thick to breathe, and left every man, woman, and child with the sensation that unseen eyes watched from beneath the earth. By the time the townsfolk gathered for the 13th reburial, fear had become a sickness. No one wanted to be there, yet none dared refuse. The Wither's children had been dug up 12 times before, and each time their coffins told the same story. Claw marks, broken fingers, faces frozen in agony. Sheriff Albright, his face drawn and pale, stood by with his revolver resting uselessly on his hip. The weapon gave him no comfort. He was a lawman, but what law could govern the dead? The crowd encircled the graves. Lanterns cast long, shuddering shadows across the stones. Their flames flickered unnaturally, as if smothered by a presence that hungered for the light. The gravediggers, men who had performed this grim task too many times, worked with mechanical slowness. The scrape of shovels was drowned by the beating of hearts. Then the earth groaned. It was not the sound of a shovel cutting through rock, but a deep, hollow moan, as though the desert itself rejected what lay inside. The crowd stepped back, clutching one another in terror. When the coffins were finally raised, they found something worse than before. The children were not still. Their limbs had shifted since their last burial. One child's arm now rested across her chest, as though shielding herself. Another's head had turned to the side, lips parted in a frozen gasp. And the youngest, with hair matted by dried soil, had both eyes wide open, staring upward, the whites slick with moisture, glinting in the lamplight. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Someone screamed, but the sheriff silenced them with a glare. Father Miguel stumbled forward, clutching his Bible so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. "They are trapped," he whispered, voice shaking. "Their souls cannot leave this place." The men hastily lowered the coffins again, but as the ropes slid through their hands, the ground began to shiver. A dry crack split the earth, and a spray of sand hissed out like breath from an open wound. The shovels dropped. Horses screamed and bolted. Mothers dragged their children away from the fence. The gravediggers scrambled to cover the coffins, but no matter how much soil they heaped onto the graves, it shifted unnaturally, as though the earth itself spat it back. One man swore he saw a child's hand push briefly against the coffin lid from beneath, the wood bending outward before falling still. The 13th reburial ended in chaos. Some fled the town that very night, abandoning their homes to the desert wind. Those who stayed locked their doors and prayed for dawn, though none could sleep. For outside, carried on the whisper of sand and wind, came the sound of children weeping. And as the night deepened, the weeping grew into words. Faint, fractured words, names, pleas, promises. The Wither's children were no longer merely dead. They were waiting. The town of Dry Creek no longer slept. Doors stayed bolted, windows nailed shut, and lamps burned through the long hours of darkness. The 13th reburial had shaken even the most stubborn skeptics. What was once dismissed as superstition now pressed on them like a fevered weight. Inside her home, old Martha Kellings lay awake, staring at the low wooden beams above her bed. She was 73 years old, had lived through drought, famine, and Apache raids, but nothing had unsettled her soul like the sound she now heard each night. At first, it was scratching. Faint, like a rat scurrying beneath the floorboards. She had set traps, scattered poison, but nothing changed. Then came the voices, a child's laugh, the dragging whimper of a sob, and worst of all, a whisper that seemed to form words she almost, but not quite, understood. That night, when the scratching returned, she pressed her ear to the boards. Her breath trembled as she listened. Yes, the voices were clearer now. "Mama!" Her stomach turned to ice. Her own son had died 40 years earlier, long before the Wither's children were ever buried. Yet the voice was his. The same lilt, the same trembling tone he had carried when fever took him in her arms. She fled her room, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, but the sound followed. Down the hall, across the kitchen, until she stumbled outside. The desert air was cold, yet she could still hear it, just beneath her feet, as though the earth itself carried the voices of children. By morning, Martha Kellings was gone. Her neighbours found her door wide open, her lamp still burning, but no sign of her. The only clue was the trail of bare footprints in the dust, leading from her porch toward the Withers' graves and ending abruptly at the fence. She was the first to vanish. In the weeks that followed, others claimed to hear the same thing, faint whispers beneath their homes, under the floorboards, seeping up through the cracks of the earth. The voices always belonged to someone familiar: lost children, dead siblings, infants taken by sickness. It was as if the Withers children had learned a new trick. They no longer needed to claw their way out of coffins. They could worm their voices into the living, using grief as a key. Sheriff Albright tried to restore order, though he himself had begun to hear things. He would sit at his desk at night, staring at the iron star pinned to his vest, when a voice called to him from the corner of the room. His daughter, dead 5 winters past, saying, "Daddy, help me, please." He would rise, revolver in hand, searching the shadows. But the room was always empty. Only the faint smell of earth lingered. By the end of that month, 5 townsfolk were missing. None had left tracks. None left behind a struggle. Only the sound of voices calling them into the desert and the silence that followed. Father Miguel declared the land cursed, the souls of the children unclean and restless. He preached that the desert was no longer God's ground, but a doorway to something else. Few dared argue, but some whispered that it was not the devil's doing at all. It was the children themselves. And if that were true, then the curse was not of hell, but of the bloodline that refused to die. The Withers children were reaching out from the earth, and Dry Creek was beginning to answer. The night of June 3rd, 1856, marked a shift in Dry Creek. Until then, the town had endured whispers, vanishings, and the slow collapse of reason, but no one had seen the Withers children with their own eyes. That changed beneath the pale glow of a cloud-choked moon. It began at the edge of town, near the sagging house of Henry Pike. Pike was a cattleman, a broad-shouldered man with scars from Indian raids and bar brawls, the kind who claimed he feared nothing born of this world. But his bravado cracked that night, when his youngest boy, Jacob, shook him awake in the dead of night. "Pa," Jacob whispered, tugging at his arm, "there's a girl at the window." Henry groaned, irritated more than alarmed, until he saw his son's pale face. He reached for the lantern, lit the wick, and turned toward the window that looked out over the field. And there she stood, a little girl, barefoot, hair in tangled braids, a white shift caked with dust. Her face was pressed against the glass, eyes wide, lips moving though no sound came through. Pike stumbled back, nearly knocking over the lamp. The girl's eyes were not right. They were the colour of wet clay, dull and grey, yet glinting faintly like the moon. He knew her face. Everyone in town did. Sarah Withers, dead, buried and reburied 13 times. Jacob clung to his father's arm, trembling. "She's asking to come in." Indeed, her lips were moving, forming words again and again, though muffled by the pain. Pike forced himself closer. His heart thudded as he read the shapes her mouth made. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." Her small hand lifted, pressing flat against the window. The glass frosted over where her palm touched, as though winter itself leaked from her skin. Henry Pike did what few men of Dry Creek would have had the courage to do. He grabbed his rifle. His wife screamed as he threw open the door and stormed out into the yard, lantern swinging in one hand, weapon in the other. But the yard was empty. The girl was gone. The field stretched into the desert, unbroken but for the pale bones of sagebrush. The only sound was the creak of the windmill and the faint rattle of dry grass. Pike shouted, voice ragged with fury and fear, "If that's some trick, I'll shoot you dead, child or no child." Silence. Then, from the field, a chorus of laughter. Not one voice, but many. Children, laughing, high and shrill, yet hollow, as though rising from deep beneath the ground. The lantern light faltered as the air turned sharp and cold, and for a moment Pike swore he saw dozens of figures moving just beyond the reach of the flame. Small shapes, crawling, dragging themselves across the dust. When he blinked, they were gone. The next morning, Pike packed his family's things and left town without a word. He was not the last. By the time the tale spread, Dry Creek was no longer divided between believers and skeptics. The Wither's children were no longer whispers or half-seen shadows. They had been seen. And those who saw them carried the mark of it like a sickness. Martha Kellings's cousin swore she saw the old woman walking the road days after her disappearance, barefoot, her face slack and pale, her eyes empty. But when she called out to her, Martha did not answer. She only opened her mouth in a soundless scream and vanished into the sand. Sheriff Albright tried to deny it all, to hold order together, but even he faltered when his deputies began to desert. One by one, they left their badges on his desk, saying no lawman's oath could bind them to a town the dead had claimed. The priest, Father Miguel, declared a fast and prayer vigil. He gathered those still faithful in the church, urging them to stay through the night. They lit candles, sang hymns, clutched rosaries until their knuckles bled. But even there, the children came. The first candle guttered, though no wind stirred. A chill seeped into the pews. The voices began, faint at first, like wind in the rafters, then louder. The parishioners froze as they realized the words were the same, repeated by many voices at once. Let us in, let us in, let us in. The youngest boy in the congregation, a 10-year-old named Samuel, suddenly stood, his eyes glassy. In a voice not his own, he whispered, "We're cold." His mother screamed, clutching him to her chest, but he only laughed. A hollow, mirthless laugh that did not belong to any child of the living. The candles burst all at once, plunging the church into darkness. The screams that followed were not all human. When daylight returned, the church was intact, but no one spoke of what had happened. Some refused to leave their homes. Others began to flee Dry Creek entirely, leaving wagons behind, walking barefoot into the desert if they had to. Those who remained whispered of a truth too awful to accept aloud. The Wither's children had not merely been cursed to unrest. They had been changed. Whatever they were now, they were not bound to their coffins. They could move. They could speak. They could take the voices of the lost, and perhaps even the flesh of the missing. And with each passing night, they grew stronger. Dry Creek had become their playground. And no grave would ever hold them again. Dry Creek had fallen into a rhythm of terror. Each night, as the sun vanished behind the mesas, the town held its breath. Those who could lock themselves indoors did so. Others fled to neighbouring settlements. But a few, stubborn or desperate, remained. Among them was Sheriff Albright, Father Miguel, and 3 townsfolk brave or foolish enough to confront the source of the nightmare. It began at dusk. Lanterns swung from porches, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked wooden boards of homes. The wind carried a faint, high-pitched giggle, the sound of children playing, except the desert around Dry Creek offered no playground, only dust, sagebrush, and the hard-packed soil of the Wither's plot. Sheriff Albright gathered the remaining residents outside the church. His face was pale, drawn, eyes rimmed red from nights spent sleepless, listening to phantom cries. Father Miguel clutched a Bible, chanting quietly, beads slipping through fingers in rhythm with his prayers. "This ends tonight," the sheriff said, voice taut. "We confront them. Whatever this is, whatever has claimed our town, we face it." The group formed a makeshift posse. They carried lanterns, rifles, and shovels. Each step toward the cemetery was heavy, dragging against the weight of fear pressing from below. Shadows shifted unnaturally, the air thickening as if the desert itself had turned viscous. The first sign of the children's presence came from the ground. Small, bare footprints trailed across the dusty path leading from town. They were impossibly pale against the earth, yet crisp as if pressed yesterday, though no living child could have walked there. The sheriff knelt, examining the prints. "They're here," he said, voice low. And they're waiting. Father Miguel muttered a prayer, voice quivering. May the Lord shield us. May his mercy guide our steps. By the time they reached the Wither's plot, darkness had swallowed the land completely. The graves of the children lay before them, 13 in total, each mound unnaturally smooth, as if the earth rejected the bodies inside. The sheriff raised his lantern, revealing faint indentations on each grave, small claw marks that were too deliberate to be natural. A sudden, piercing giggle echoed from the shadows. One of the townsfolk, a young man named Thomas, pointed toward the far edge of the plot. I see one, he stammered. A little girl. She's just standing there. The girl wore a tattered white dress, dirt-caked and torn. Her hair hung in damp clumps. She smiled, an expression that should have been innocent, but the sheriff knew better. There was malice in the angle of her jaw, a cruelty in her wide, clay-coloured eyes. "Do not look away," Father Miguel hissed, gripping Thomas's arm. "Do not—" A sudden movement. The girl stepped forward, and the ground beneath her seemed to rise, frost forming where none should exist. The others froze as more shapes emerged, dozens of tiny figures rising from the earth, dragging themselves like spiders, crawling from their graves. Their faces were twisted, pale as death, eyes glowing faintly in the lantern light, fingernails elongated, cracked, claws caked with soil. Each movement was jerky, unnatural, as though marionettes of flesh manipulated by some unseen hand. "Get back!" Sheriff Albright shouted, raising his rifle. He fired, and the crack of gunpowder echoed through the night, but bullets passed through them as though through mist. When the smoke cleared, they were still advancing. The laughter had become a chorus, high-pitched and hollow, bouncing off the surrounding mesas, disorienting the humans. Father Miguel drew a circle in the dirt with chalk, reciting prayers faster now, voice shaking. The figures paused at its edge, tilting their heads, observing. One girl raised a hand and spoke, not in voice, but directly into the minds of those inside the circle. "You belong to us now!" Thomas screamed, clutching his ears, while Sheriff Albright and the priest tried to hold the line. Lanterns flickered, wind tore at their clothing, and shadows danced across the graves as if alive. The earth beneath their feet heaved, throwing them off balance. It was then that the first physical attack occurred. A small hand shot from the ground, grasping Father Miguel's ankle. He stumbled, nearly falling into the open soil. Sheriff Albright lunged, swinging his rifle to strike at the hand, but it retracted into the dirt, leaving nothing behind except a faint smear of blood. Panic erupted. The townsfolk tried to flee, but the figures advanced in unison, moving impossibly fast despite their jerky motions. Some leapt, defying gravity, landing silently. Others melted into the shadows, only to reappear behind the living. The sheriff realized the truth too late. The Wither's children were not merely dead. They had become conduits of something beyond death, able to manipulate perception, matter, and fear itself. Each step, each glance, pulled the living closer into their nightmare. Father Miguel screamed a prayer, voice hoarse and raw. In nomine Patris, in nomine Filii, in nomine Spiritus Sancti. But the wind carried his words away, dispersing them, leaving only the chorus of hollow laughter. One by one, the lanterns went out. Shadows merged, obscuring all forms. The sheriff fired blindly into the darkness, the smell of burnt powder mixing with the cold, earthy scent of disturbed graves. Then came silence. When the light of dawn finally touched the desert floor, Dry Creek had changed forever. Some bodies were found, slumped over lanterns, rifle in hand, eyes wide and frozen in terror. Others had vanished entirely. The Wither's children's graves were empty, the mounds flattened. No trace of footprints remained. The town would never recover. And those who remained swore that every night, from beneath the earth, the hollow laughter returned, echoing across the desert, promising that the Wither's children were never truly gone. And in that promise lay the final unbearable truth. They were patient, tireless, and eternal. The morning after the night of hollow laughter, Dry Creek lay in silence, a silence heavy with dread, as if the desert itself had absorbed the echoes of the previous night. Those who survived wandered dazed through the streets, faces pale, eyes wide, voices trembling. Nothing spoke of hope, only of anticipation, a slow gnawing that the Wither's children would return. Sheriff Albright convened the few remaining townsfolk at the church. Father Miguel, still trembling from the attacks, held the Bible as if it were a shield. "We must understand what we face," Albright said, voice rough and broken, though still firm enough to command attention. "We cannot run. We cannot hide. We descend into it, into the source." The source, the Wither's plot itself. 13 graves, 13 children, and some force beyond comprehension that had turned these innocent souls into predators. By midday, the group assembled at the boundary of the cemetery. Shovels, picks, lanterns, and even some crude charms blessed by Father Miguel were brought along. Each step toward the graves was heavy, weighted by terror. The air grew thick with the smell of damp soil and decay, though no rain had fallen. The desert itself seemed to breathe in anticipation. Albright chose to start with the first grave, the one belonging to the eldest child. The mound had shifted overnight, flattened almost perfectly, as though something beneath the earth had pressed upward, leaving the surface unnaturally smooth. The sheriff knelt, tracing faint claw marks on the soil. The earth was unnaturally cold beneath his fingers, and yet dry, as if frost and dust coexisted in impossible harmony. Father Miguel chanted prayers, voice trembling but resolute. As the shovels dug, the soil resisted, compact yet yielding unnaturally. Then, faintly at first, a sound, scratching from beneath the dirt. The digging ceased. The group froze, listening. The scratching grew louder, irregular, desperate. Suddenly, the dirt collapsed inward as something moved beneath it. The first scream came from Thomas, one of the townsfolk, as tiny hands emerged from the soil, fingers splayed, claws biting into the earth. Then more appeared. The eldest Wither's child, her eyes dull and grey, rose slowly, dragging herself from her grave. Her gaze swept over the intruders, landing last on Father Miguel. "You should not have come," she whispered, voice like a wind over bare bones, resonating directly into the mind of each observer. Other children followed, emerging from their graves, dragging themselves across the earth. Their limbs bent at impossible angles, faces twisted in perpetual terror. The desert around them shimmered unnaturally, a heatless distortion, making distances appear longer, closer, then impossible to judge. Albright fired his rifle. The bullets tore through the figures harmlessly. Father Miguel swung a holy symbol, chanting faster, voice cracking under the strain. "In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti, depart, ye unclean spirits." But the Wither's children advanced. One reached Thomas and touched his shoulder. Instantly, the boy screamed, collapsing, his eyes rolling back, mouth forming a soundless, wordless scream. His body shivered violently, as if some invisible wire pulled every muscle into spasms. Albright tried to intervene, swinging his rifle like a club, but another child struck, pushing him back. The sheriff's feet slipped in the sand-dirt mix. He fell, rolling to avoid unseen claws scraping at him. Lanterns were toppled, the flames guttered and went out, leaving only the grey pre-dawn light and the unearthly forms of the children. Father Miguel, desperate, dropped to his knees, pressing a hand to the dirt. "May the Lord hear me. May his mercy shield the innocent." His voice rose into a chant, blending scripture and improvised supplication. The eldest child paused, tilting her head, observing. Then she smiled, a grotesque alien curl of her lips. The ground itself responded. Cracks formed in the soil, spreading outward in geometric patterns, curling like frozen tentacles. Small eruptions of dust and frost shot upward, obscuring vision, choking those present. The desert felt alive, sentient, and aligned with the children's will. Albright realized the truth too late. They were dealing not merely with restless dead, but with a force that bent space, perception, and sanity. The children were conduits, amplifiers, and puppeteers of the hollow earth. Each movement, each step, each gaze bent reality subtly, making every action uncertain. Amid the chaos, the eldest child lifted her hand. The others froze. Then, slowly, deliberately, the air vibrated, carrying voices, not the children's this time, but countless faint, overlapping whispers of those previously lost to the desert. They spoke in a chorus, calling, pleading, laughing, crying. Each word weighed on the mind like stone. The group staggered back. Thomas lay convulsing, Samuel cried without sound, and Albright gritted his teeth, trying to maintain focus. Father Miguel shouted a final litany of exorcism, voice raw and desperate. The children recoiled slightly, but the earth's movement intensified. Small fissures opened around them, as if the land itself sought to swallow the living. Realizing they could not hold their ground, Albright ordered a retreat. They stumbled back toward the town, dirt clinging to hair and clothes, every step shadowed by the distant, unyielding forms of the Wither's children. The whispers followed them, echoing through the desert and deep into the hills. By midday, the survivors reached the outskirts of Dry Creek. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow. Each step had been a battle against both flesh and perception. Father Miguel spoke, voice shaking. "We have seen them, and they are not dead. They are something beyond and beneath. Whatever this is, it cannot be fought with rifles or prayer alone." Albright looked back at the cemetery. The mounds were smooth, undisturbed, as if the children had never emerged. But he knew better. They had seen the truth, and the desert would never let them forget it. The Wither's children were patient. They would wait. They would watch. And when the time was right, they would rise again. The desert had a way of keeping secrets, but the Wither's children demanded revelation. Dry Creek, a town hollowed by fear and loss, became the stage upon which the past clawed itself into the present. Sheriff Albright and Father Miguel, the last resolute authorities left, convened the survivors in the church. The building smelled of burned candles and the damp of the earth itself, carried inside through cracked floorboards. "Whatever they are," Albright said, voice strained, "they follow a pattern. We've survived their attacks, but we don't understand why. Not yet. And until we do, nothing will end." Father Miguel nodded, kneeling with eyes closed. "There is ritual. There is purpose. The bloodline of the Withers. It is tied to this." He spoke of old diaries recovered from the town archives, records that no one had dared open for decades. Among them were the writings of Reverend Elias Withers, patriarch of the family, a man reputed to be devout yet secretive. His notes were fragmented, filled with liturgical phrases in Latin, interspersed with diagrams of stars, circles, and symbols no man alive could fully interpret. "Here," Miguel whispered, pointing at one page, the ink faded but readable. "He writes of 13 children, but not merely children, vessels. He speaks of binding, of sacrifice, of resistance to death. He believed the soul could be preserved, even multiplied, through precise rites." Albright frowned, flipping the brittle pages with gloved fingers. "Are you saying the children weren't meant to die?" Father Miguel's lips pressed into a thin line. "They were never intended to leave. Not truly. Their bodies, their blood, their souls. They were tethered to the desert itself. A curse, yes, but a curse intended as protection. Something went wrong." The group leaned closer, uneasy, as Miguel read aloud the passages of ritual. The symbols formed patterns of circles, spirals, intersecting lines, geometry infused with incantation. The patriarch had intended to tether the spirits to the earth, but somewhere, in the repetition of grief, in the multiple exhumations, the ritual fractured. The Wither's children became untethered, no longer mere spirits or restless dead. They became conduits, bridging the living world and a space beneath the desert that obeyed no natural law. Their voices, their laughter, their claws, all manifestations of a corrupted ritual, a bloodline unwilling to die, and an earth unwilling to contain them. Albright swallowed, voice thick. Then every time someone dug them up, every time we moved the soil, every time we disturbed them, we made it worse. Father Miguel nodded. Each reburial was a wound, and each wound fed them. They learned, adapted, changed. Their patience spans decades, but their hunger grows. Outside, a wind stirred the church's shutters. A faint scratching echoed faintly, almost imperceptibly at first, and then louder. The children were watching, listening, waiting. One survivor, Mary Caldwell, trembled as she spoke. Can we stop them? Father Miguel's voice was grave, trembling. Not with force, not with prayer alone. The ritual, it must be completed. But it requires knowledge, and knowledge lost to time. Albright clenched his fists. Time is the one thing we don't have. They've grown stronger with each night. Every hour Dry Creek and anyone nearby loses more ground to them. They debated, poring over the patriarch's notes, cross-referencing names, dates, and rituals. Patterns emerged. The number 13 repeated obsessively. 13 children, 13 reburials, 13 circles in the ritual diagrams. The recurring motif of numbers, geometry, and repetition hinted at a rule that had been broken. Life and death, order and chaos, tethered and untethered, all disrupted by human action. Father Miguel stood abruptly, pointing to a passage that made the lantern light tremble across his face. Here, it speaks of a final binding, a completion ritual. If we act quickly, using the soil, bloodline remnants, and the correct incantations, it may be possible to tether them once more. But it is dangerous. The ritual calls for the participation of the living bloodline, or its proxies, and there is risk of corruption. Albright felt the weight of his duty. The town's survival rested on decisions he had never been trained to make. A mistake now would not merely cost lives. It could unleash the children's wrath upon the wider world, beyond Dry Creek, beyond the desert, beyond comprehension. As they planned, the faint whispers grew outside the church. The scratching increased in tempo, like hundreds of tiny nails over the floorboards. Shadows of movement flickered across the windows. The Wither's children had not merely been waiting. They were aware, anticipating. They understood. They were patient. Father Miguel spoke once more. We begin at nightfall. The ritual must be done where they were born, where the curse originated. And we must act as one. Fear is their weapon. Unity is ours. And yet, we do not know if it will succeed. We are treading where men should not tread. But to do nothing is to surrender. Albright nodded grimly. He gathered the survivors. Their eyes reflected the flickering candlelight, but also something deeper. Dread, understanding, and determination. Tonight, the Wither's children would be confronted again. But this time, it would not be chance. This time, it would be deliberate. And as they stepped into the desert wind, the faint echo of laughter carried behind them, hollow, patient, and full of promise. Night fell over Dry Creek like a suffocating shroud. The wind had grown colder, sharper, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of earth disturbed by unseen hands. The survivors gathered at the Wither's plot, armed with lanterns, shovels, and the notes of Reverend Elias Withers clutched tightly. Every face was pale, every step hesitant, yet determination pushed them forward. Father Miguel began the preparation. Circles of chalk were drawn around the mounds of earth, 13 in total, the lines intersecting in precise geometry. Small vials of blood collected from distant relatives of the Wither's lineage were poured into shallow indentations at each grave. Candles were positioned at calculated intervals. Each flicker of flame seemed to bend unnaturally, casting shadows that shifted against the laws of physics. Sheriff Albright surveyed the perimeter. The desert was silent, yet silence had become dangerous. It meant the Withers children were near, observing. They did not rush forward. They did not need to. Patience was their ally, anticipation their weapon. Father Miguel began the incantation, voice low and ritualistic. The Latin phrases mixed with strange syllables from the patriarch's diaries, forming a rhythm that resonated with the very ground beneath them. The earth trembled faintly at first, like a heartbeat, and then more strongly, as if counting down the moments until something emerged. The first child appeared, crawling from the mound of her grave. She moved with unnatural grace, pale eyes reflecting the lantern light. Then another followed, and another, until all 13 had risen. They did not speak, yet their presence pressed on the survivors' minds. Whispers formed in the air, overlapping, distorted, fragmented pleas, commands, and laughter. Thomas, the youngest townsfolk survivor, trembled. They're watching, he muttered. They always do, Albright replied grimly. Focus on the ritual. That is our shield. The eldest child raised a hand. The air grew cold, frost forming in geometric patterns along the mounds. The ground vibrated, small fissures spreading outward like veins. The children's bodies twitched unnaturally, their faces contorting in expressions of mockery and pain simultaneously. Father Miguel's chant grew faster, louder, blending desperation with authority. The lines of chalk began to glow faintly, a subtle phosphorescence that pulsed in time with the incantation. The desert seemed to hum, the sound vibrating through bones, carrying dread and anticipation. Suddenly, the ground erupted. One of the mounds split violently, throwing a column of soil and frost into the air. A child fell forward, landing in the circle, and the circle flickered, the chalk lines momentarily dimming. The Withers children were resisting. They understood. They were not mere victims of the broken ritual. They were active participants, unwilling to be bound again. Albright raised his rifle instinctively, but bullets passed through them as if they were fog. The children's eyes glowed with an unnatural grey, and they advanced, hands clawing at the edges of the circles. Father Miguel shouted, voice cracking, "Hold them at the perimeter! Do not let fear rule!" The survivors formed a ring around the chalk, shoving, shouting, and swinging whatever they could. The children retreated slightly, but only to regroup. Their movement was jerky, yet purposeful, deliberate, almost ritualistic in its chaos. Each step they took seemed to warp space around them. Lanterns flickered violently, and the shadows cast by the survivors danced independently, twisting and elongating. One of the townsfolk, Mary Caldwell, screamed as a hand shot from the earth outside the circle, grazing her leg. A fine layer of frost formed where it touched her skin. She fell back, clutching her leg, the chill burning like ice through flesh. Father Miguel redoubled his efforts, reciting a hidden passage from the patriarch's notes. The words resonated, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. Slowly, the children faltered, bodies twitching as if pulled by unseen strings. Their glowing eyes flickered, momentarily confused by the ritual's power. Albright took a deep breath, voice steady despite the terror, and bellowed, "We finish this now! Hold the line!" The survivors pressed their advantage. Shovels and lanterns formed a barrier, and the combination of bloodline blood, chalk geometry, and incantation began to take effect. The eldest child's eyes widened in what might have been recognition or fear. The ground beneath the other mounds began to bubble faintly, the soil vibrating as if trying to reject the binding. The ritual's first stage was successful. The children were tethered, partially. They writhed, trying to break free, but the geometric patterns held them in check. Their laughter became strangled, their whispers dissonant. the harmony of terror breaking into fragmented notes. Yet even as the survivors breathed a brief sigh of relief, a larger dread settled upon them. The children's partial tether was not containment, it was preparation. They had learned the rules of the ritual, and even in restraint, they communicated an understanding far beyond mortal comprehension. Father Miguel's voice was hoarse, trembling, as he concluded the first stage. It is done, for now. But know this, the tether is fragile. They are patient, intelligent, and eternal. Our work is far from complete. Albright looked across the mounds, eyes narrowing. And if we fail next time? Miguel did not answer. His gaze remained fixed on the children, restrained but alive, and on the desert beyond, where whispers carried on the wind. The Wither's children had been bound for now, but they had not been stopped. Outside, the faint scratching and hollow laughter returned, distant but unmistakable, reminding all present that the desert and its cursed children never forgot. The survivors left the cemetery at dawn, exhausted, their bodies aching, their minds raw from exposure to horrors no human should witness. They had won a minor victory, but the true battle, the ritual's completion, awaited. And with each sunrise, the Wither's children learned, waited, and adapted. The desert morning was deceptive. A pale sun rose over Dry Creek, casting long shadows across the cracked streets, but the heat brought no comfort. The survivors emerged from the Wither's plot, bodies weary, minds frayed, hearts pounding with exhaustion and relief. Yet Father Miguel knew better. Relief in the presence of the Wither's children was dangerous. The first signs appeared as they returned to town. Livestock, which had survived previous nights, lay in unnatural positions, twisted, eyes wide, flesh pale and cold. Tracks led from the cemetery, but not directly. They branched in impossible geometries, some ending in open ground, some returning to Dry Creek, as though the desert itself had been rearranged. We didn't finish it, Miguel murmured, scanning the town. The tether is incomplete. They are testing boundaries. Learning Sheriff Albright nodded grimly. Then we need to reinforce the ritual, now. Before nightfall, the group began preparations. Chalk lines were retraced, bloodlines verified, candles relit. But the Wither's children had already begun to interfere. The partial tether had not only restrained them, it had amplified their awareness. They moved silently through the desert, observing, probing weaknesses, whispering in the minds of the survivors. At first, it was subtle. A sudden drop in temperature, frost creeping along floorboards, the faint echo of a child's laugh just outside a window. Thomas, who had survived the first stage, complained of voices at the edge of perception, whispering his name. Mary Caldwell awoke to find a tiny handprint pressed into her shoulder. No warmth, no weight, just the cold impression of flesh. By midday, the disruption became undeniable. Chalk lines drawn earlier had shifted overnight. Candles, when lit, sputtered violently, smoke curling in shapes that resembled small, clawed hands. Every attempt to reinforce the ritual was met with interference. The children did not need to strike physically. They merely altered reality around them. Father Miguel was forced to alter the incantation, blending fragments of the patriarch's notes with extemporaneous prayers. Sweat poured down his face, lips moving frantically as he attempted to correct the tether. Albright and the others held the lines, weapons drawn, ready to defend against whatever manifestation might emerge. Then it began. The ground around the Wither's plot trembled in concentric waves. Fissures opened, curling outward in fractal patterns. From each crack, faint grey shapes emerged. Hands, faces, twisted glimpses of the dead, as if the desert itself had become a conduit for the children's power. They clawed at the lines, dissolving chalk where it had been drawn, disturbing the fragile geometry that restrained them. One figure appeared at the town well, a pale, barefoot girl with hair plastered to her face. She whispered Thomas's name directly into his mind. "Come with us," she breathed. His eyes glazed. He took a step forward before Albright seized him, dragging him back. Mary screamed as the well's surface seemed to ripple, forming a mirror of her own face. Behind it, dozens of small forms pressed against the water, mouths open in silent cries. The Wither's children were not confined. They were reaching outward, manipulating matter, perception, and fear simultaneously. Father Miguel's chanting grew frantic. The ritual began to backfire. Instead of strengthening the tether, the children exploited it. The geometry intended to contain them now served as a channel, amplifying their reach. The desert trembled in response, echoes of hollow laughter cascading across the town. Albright realized the truth. Their victory in Chapter 11 had been temporary. The children were patient and intelligent. Every ritual, every attempt to bind them, had taught them new ways to resist and expand their influence. The partial tether was not control. It was instruction. By nightfall, Dry Creek was a battlefield of perception. Lanterns flickered, shadows elongated, whispers overlapped in chaotic harmony. Townsfolk staggered through streets, eyes wide with terror, as objects moved unnaturally. Doors slammed without wind, and walls seemed to breathe. The Wither's children were everywhere and nowhere, existing both as flesh and as an extension of the desert itself. Father Miguel fell to his knees, voice raw. We cannot hold them as before. The tether is fractured. We must find another way. Albright looked at the townsfolk. Their eyes were hollow. Hope was dim. The Wither's children were no longer just children. They were a force, patient, intelligent, and increasingly omnipresent. And in the distance, faintly, echoing through the fractured bonds of reality, came a chorus of hollow laughter. The desert had claimed Dry Creek, and the survivors were left to wonder if the tether could fracture so easily. What chance did they have of completing the ritual at all? The night settled over Dry Creek like a living shroud, thick and suffocating. Silence ruled at first, yet it was a silence that screamed. Every survivor knew it. The Wither's children were watching, waiting, calculating. The partial tether had fractured. Their influence spread outward like frost across glass, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Father Miguel, clutching the patriarch's notes and muttering prayers, led the group toward the Wither's plot. Lanterns flickered, casting long, impossible shadows across the desert. The air was heavy with frost and dust, a cold humidity that settled deep in the lungs. Every footstep felt labored, as if the ground itself resisted intrusion. Albright's rifle hung at his side. It was useless now, a relic of physical law against entities that had already learned to exist outside it. He glanced at Thomas and Mary Caldwell. Their eyes were hollow, yet they followed, compelled by a fragile thread of hope. As they approached the graves, the desert betrayed subtle signs of corruption. Rocks shifted against gravity, faint claw marks traced themselves in the sand, and the air carried faint whispers, some human, some impossibly alien. A column of frost rose from the far side of the cemetery, spiraling like a twisting finger pointing toward them. Father Miguel began the incantation, the rhythm familiar yet insufficient. The lines of chalk glowed faintly, but the light seemed strained, struggling against an unseen pressure. The Wither's children emerged, 13 in number, but no longer confined to the mounds. They moved through the desert itself, bending space, appearing simultaneously near and far, their laughter a chorus of overlapping time. One child raised a hand, and suddenly the survivors were assailed with visions. Dry Creek fractured in their minds, houses burned, the desert fissured, bodies of the lost twisted and fused with earth. Every failed reburial, every disturbance of the graves, every act of fear, they saw it all, magnified. The children's power was no longer limited to the cemetery. It resonated throughout the town. Thomas staggered, pressing his hands to his ears. I can hear them. Inside me. Mary gasped, pointing to the ground. Frost spread in spirals, forming geometries that mirrored the chalk circles. The partial tether had created conduits, invisible channels through which the children's will flowed. Albright realized the horrifying truth. They could not simply bind the children. They had become nodes of influence, capable of fracturing reality itself. Every attempt to tether them further would propagate new fractures, new conduits for their power. The desert itself had become an extension of their mind, patient, adaptive, and unforgiving. Father Miguel's chanting faltered, voice quivering with the weight of revelation. We have underestimated them. They are not merely tethered spirits, they are echoes. Residual consciousness fused with the earth, amplified by every act of fear and grief. From the shadows of the desert, one of the smaller children approached. Her gait was jerky, unnatural, yet deliberate. She stopped mere feet from Albright, tilting her head, staring into his soul. "You are next," the thought formed in his mind, clear and unassailable, bypassing speech entirely. Albright swung his rifle, but it passed harmlessly through her. Father Miguel's hands trembled, clutching the patriarch's notes. He understood now that the children's power had become systemic, rooted in the very geometry of the desert, feeding on fear and amplified by the failures of the survivors themselves. One by one, the 13 children converged toward the central circle, their bodies flickering in and out of existence. The frost thickened, wrapping around lanterns, shovels, and the feet of the living. Every breath carried the scent of earth, decay, and the metallic tang of blood long buried. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the desert. Thomas collapsed, thrashing violently as whispers consumed his mind. Mary screamed, clutching him, but the frost on her hands froze instantly to the bone. Albright tried to pull them away, but the desert itself resisted, forming walls and funnels that channeled the children's presence. Father Miguel realized a terrible truth. The partial tether had become an amplifier. Their attempts to contain the children had given them the ability to project their consciousness across distance, to manipulate matter, perception, and fear simultaneously. They were no longer bound to the graves. They were everywhere, patient, intelligent, and omnipresent. The eldest child approached the central chalk circle, and the desert seemed to bend around her. Frost spiraled into impossible geometric forms, converging on her as if acknowledging her dominion. Her voice, though no sound passed her lips, resonated directly in their minds. "You cannot hold us. You cannot stop the echo." Father Miguel's voice broke as he raised his hands. "We must retreat. Live to fight another day. Do not let despair consume you." Albright dragged Thomas toward the outskirts of the desert, lanterns flickering violently. Mary followed, but each step felt heavier, reality itself resisting their escape. Behind them, the Withers children remained in the desert, their forms flickering, echoing, waiting. As dawn broke, Dry Creek was partially restored to apparent calm. The frost had melted. The desert seemed still. But the echoes remained. Whispers lingered on the wind, faint scratching at floorboards, shadows moving independently. The tether had been fractured, and the children's influence now extended beyond the cemetery, beyond Dry Creek, into the surrounding mesas and canyons. The survivors had lived, but at what cost? Every glance into the desert carried the sense that they were being watched. Every sound reminded them that the Withers children were no longer simply children. They were something else, something eternal, patient, and infinitely adaptive. Father Miguel whispered, voice hoarse. The ritual, incomplete. The echoes, unbound. We are not done. We are never done. Albright looked at the desert, eyes narrowing. The children had learned from them, adapted, and grown stronger. Their patience was infinite, their reach now extending into the world itself, unstoppable. And in the distance, carried on the wind, came the unmistakable hollow laughter of the Forsaken Throne, a sound that promised eternal dread. Night fell over Dry Creek. With unnatural suddenness, the sun swallowed as if by some unseen hand. The desert was silent, yet every step the survivors took carried a sense of inevitable dread. The Wither's children, tethered partially but strengthened by fractured bonds, waited like patient predators. They no longer merely haunted the land, they controlled it. Every dune, every fissure, every shadow carried their presence. Father Miguel led the group, lanterns casting a flickering, anxious glow. Chalk circles, vials of blood, and incantations were prepared for the final binding. Every element of the patriarch's notes was meticulously laid out. The survivors knew this was their last chance. Failure was unthinkable, yet omnipresent in their minds. Albright surveyed the desert. Frost spiraled along the ground in impossible patterns, converging toward the Wither's plot like living veins. The children emerged one by one, bodies flickering, moving through space as if bending the laws of reality. Their laughter, hollow, echoing, dissonant, resonated through every nerve. It was no longer a sound. It was a physical presence, vibrating in the bones, chilling the soul. Father Miguel began the incantation, voice steady despite exhaustion. Each word resonated in the earth, forming faint geometric pulses. The circles glowed with a phosphorescent light, faintly pushing against the children's presence. Yet the desert itself resisted. Small tremors shifted the survivors' footing. Fissures opened and closed, ejecting dust and frost with eerie timing. The eldest child, figure flickering between reality and shadow, approached the central circle. The frost around her twisted into impossible geometries, spirals of light and darkness intertwining. Her gaze fixed on Father Miguel, then on Albright, projecting awareness directly into their minds. You cannot bind what is already free. You cannot stop the Forsaken. Albright raised his rifle instinctively, but the weapon passed harmlessly through her form. The rest of the children advanced, weaving through the desert, shapes appearing and disappearing in impossible locations. Each step they took amplified the whispers, overlapping, distorted, carrying voices of all the dead and all the lost. Thomas and Mary, trembling, held the edges of the outer circles. The frost crept along their legs, burning cold through skin, yet they held their positions. Every instinct screamed to run, but Father Miguel's chant demanded focus, precision. Every word, every motion, every drop of bloodline blood mattered. The ritual could succeed, but only if unbroken. Suddenly, the ground convulsed violently. One of the outer circles collapsed inward, soil and frost erupting as a child breached the line. Shadows leaped with unnatural speed, stretching across the desert. Albright shoved Thomas backward, narrowly avoiding a grasping hand that seemed to pass through reality itself. The ritual faltered, lines of chalk flickering under the assault. Father, Miguel's voice rose to a shriek, blending prayer with the patriarch's instructions. The circles responded, glowing brighter, pushing against the children's influence. Yet the desert tremors intensified, the earth itself rebelling. The Wither's children had adapted. The partial tether had taught them resistance. Now they exploited it. The eldest child touched the central chalk line. Reality warped beneath her fingertips, space twisted, distances stretched impossibly. The other children mirrored her, converging, their forms flickering faster, harmonizing with the desert's unnatural rhythm. Their laughter now was unbroken, a continuous echo resonating through the desert, the town, and the survivors' minds. Albright yelled, "Hold the line! Focus on the ritual!" The survivors pressed every ounce of willpower into the incantation. Father Miguel's hands glowed faintly, chalk vibrating under his touch. Bloodline vials poured into the circles, each drop pulsing with strange light. The desert trembled violently, fissures tearing open and closing, frost spiraling like sentient fingers. The children resisted, bodies twitching, expressions flickering between children, spirits, and incomprehensible alien forms. Then, A moment of synchronicity. The circles aligned perfectly, light and blood intertwining, forming a resonance that the desert could not resist. The Wither's children shrieked, a soundless cry that vibrated through bones and nerves. Frost twisted violently, spirals snapping inward, and the children's forms flickered, then solidified, tethered once more, their movement confined to the chalk circles. Father Miguel collapsed, exhausted, voice barely audible. It is done. For now. Albright surveyed the plot. The children were restrained, though their eyes glowed faintly, awareness intact. The desert itself seemed calmer, yet unnatural shadows lingered at the edges. The tether was re-established, but the fractures in reality remained. The Wither's children had learned, adapted, and now waited within their bounds, patient, intelligent, and eternal. The survivors staggered back toward town. Thomas shivered violently, Mary's hands still frostbitten, Albright bleeding from minor frost-induced lacerations. Every step echoed with hollow laughter, whispers that promised patience and vengeance. They had won, yet the victory was Pyrrhic. Father Miguel's eyes scanned the desert. They are contained, but not defeated. Their influence spreads through patience and memory. The tether holds, but only as long as it is maintained. Should it fail, should fear allow it, the Forsaken will rise again. Albright nodded, grim. The town had survived, yet the desert and its children remained a living, breathing threat. The Wither's children were no longer mere cursed souls. They were an intelligence tied to the land, adapting, calculating, and waiting for the moment to reclaim freedom. The survivors entered the town silently, carrying the weight of exhaustion and dread. The desert wind whispered through Dry Creek's cracked streets, carrying the echo of a promise. The Forsaken throne would not be denied forever. Dawn broke over Dry Creek in muted shades of grey, as if the sun itself feared to illuminate what had transpired. The survivors moved through the town in silence, every step measured, every glance wary. The Wither's plot was contained. The ritual had succeeded, but the cost was palpable. Exhaustion clung to their bodies like a second skin, and in their eyes lingered a terror that no sleep could erase. Father Miguel led the group to the center of the cemetery, inspecting the chalk lines and vials of blood. The circles glowed faintly, a quiet pulse that indicated success, yet a dissonant hum resonated through the ground. The Wither's children remained tethered, eyes glowing with unnatural light, expressions oscillating between innocence and something older, something patient. Albright surveyed the desert. The fissures, frost spirals, and geometric distortions had receded, but not vanished entirely. The children had been restrained, yet the desert still bore the mark of their presence. The partial tether had become more than a prison. It was a conduit, a bridge between human understanding and a force beyond comprehension. Mary Caldwell shivered as she stepped over a frost-covered mound. Do you think they're gone? Father Miguel shook his head slowly. Gone? Number. They remain, patient, eternal. The tether holds them, but it also allows them to exist within the desert itself. They have learned, adapted, and grown stronger. They wait. Thomas, eyes wide and haunted, whispered, "They can reach us again." Miguel did not answer immediately. Instead, he traced a finger along one of the glowing chalk lines. Yes, and they will. Patience is infinite. Fear feeds them. Memory strengthens them. Every act of negligence, every lapse in vigilance allows the Forsaken to extend their influence. The tether is fragile. We have not defeated them. We have delayed them. Albright's gaze swept across the desert, beyond the town's limits. Shadows twisted unnaturally at the horizon. Faint laughter carried on the wind, and whispers brushed against their minds. The Wither's children were contained, yet not confined. They had become part of the desert itself, an intelligence that learned from every failure, every human intervention. The survivors regrouped in the church. Candles burned low, the scent of wax and earth filling the air. Father Miguel knelt, murmuring prayers for the living and the dead alike. Albright stood by the doorway, rifle in hand, but knowing it was meaningless against what remained. Outside, faint scratches echoed against the church walls. The desert whispered. Shadows shifted. The Wither's children's forms flickered at the periphery of vision, here, there, everywhere and nowhere. They waited, patient as stone, eternal as the desert. Father, Miguel addressed the survivors. We have contained the threat for now, but understand this. The Forsaken Throne is not defeated. It endures. The children, or what they have become, are part of the world now. Our duty is to remember, to maintain the tether, and to prevent them from breaking free again. Fail, and they will reclaim all they were denied. Albright nodded grimly. Then we hold, we survive, and we watch. The desert wind carried the faintest echo of hollow laughter. It was not angry, not frantic. It was patient, knowing, eternal. A reminder that the Forsaken Throne, though bound, remained ever vigilant. The survivors left Dry Creek quietly, carrying the weight of knowledge and fear. They had succeeded in preserving life, yet they knew it was Pyrrhic. The Wither's children, though restrained, had become something beyond death. A force of patience, cunning, and terror. Every shadow, every whisper, every frost spiral in the desert would remind them of what remained. And far beyond the town, where the desert stretched unbroken, the faint forms of the Wither's children lingered, flickering between worlds. Their laughter carried on the wind, hollow, eternal, and unyielding. The tether had held, but the Forsaken remained. Dry Creek survived, the desert endured, and somewhere, patient, eternal, and always waiting, the Forsaken Throne watched.